And on the line with us is Professor Nancy MacLean. She is the William Chafee Professor of History and Public Policy at Duke University, the author of 5 books. Her most recent, and in fact, we've had her on about this, and we did a little book report on this book that's in circulation, and you can see over on YouTube, on our youtube.com/Thom Hartmann. This is an amazing book. It's Democracy in Chains, The Deep History of the Radical Right's Stealth Plan for America. Nancy, welcome back to the program.
It's great to be back with you, Tom.
Thanks. You know, when you and I talked, when your book first came out, I had not read the entire book. I'd read maybe a third of it. And I was very impressed by it. I thought it was great. I think, you know, the history you were doing, digging up all those old documents and finding finding out about, this guy who was kind of at the center of all this. But I finally finished it a couple of weeks ago, and I read in your last chapter, you talk about how these guys who are financing the hard right, the Kochs, the Mercers, this whole bunch of right-wing billionaires, actually, I want to ask you. You used the word favela, as I recall, or barrio, in that last chapter, and said that they envision, or their policies envision, and I'd love you to clarify it for me, that America would begin to look like Mexico City. That instead of just slums, we would have massive architectures of handmade, homemade cardboard houses. And frankly, this is, I live in Portland, Oregon now. I used to live in D.C. I'm seeing this happen. We call it homeless encampments, right? Where you've got a park with, 200 people living in it. And I saw it in Hawaii, in Honolulu. There's a giant park, and it's basically been taken over. It's turned into a little city. It's an American version of a favela. Can you speak to that and how much worse that might get if we get a Lochner-type Supreme Court justice out of Donald Trump who says, hey, I'm keeping in mind the Lochner Court, the Supreme Court actually from 1897 and 1937 struck down child labor laws, struck down the right to unionize laws, struck down environmental protections, struck down workers' rights, struck down minimum wage. All these things, if we get another court like that and it starts doing this, and they've already gutted our Voting Rights Act and other things, and of course Citizens United, if we get this, this could be America. I mean, speak to that and how these guys who are funding all this think that's a good thing.
Yes. I have to say, from the research that I did, Tom, and what I've learned, since publication that has confirmed it, Americans do not understand at all how radical this Koch-led donor network project to transform our public life is. It is so radical that, as you say, essentially they see the world of capitalism, early 19th century capitalism as described by Charles Dickens, as a good thing, right? So they think that government should only have 3 functions. It should ensure the rule of law, it should guarantee social order, and it should provide for the national defense. Other than that, government has no place in their order. So government should not be allowing minimum wages. What's that?
Courts, cops, and the Army. That's it. That's all they should do.
Exactly. Courts, cops, and the Army. That's a good way to put it. Yes. So government should not be providing things like Social Security or Medicare. It should in no way be buttressing workers' rights to organize collectively, because for workers to organize collectively is to them a form of gangsterism, right? It shouldn't be allowed. Everybody should have their compensation decided by their market value. So if you are not particularly well trained, or you didn't do well in school, or you stayed home to raise your kids and now you're re-entering the labor force, tough on you. You will fall to the bottom, and that will be your fault. So it really, these are people who thought that Scrooge was right, right? There's actually an article I found to that effect.
Oh, well, actually Russell Kirk wrote about this in 1951 or 52, I think it was, and basically pointed out that that was one of the most stable, politically, one of the most stable eras in the history of the last millennia. Was, you had a very, very small a very, very small super rich class, a very, very small middle class, which Scrooge was a member of, by the way. Scrooge was, he was a small business owner with a single employee. He ran a smaller company than mine. And so he was the middle class shop owner kind of thing. And then you have this huge class of the working class with maximum wage laws to prevent them from acquiring enough wealth that they could then have political power. and they view this as the most stable system. It's basically a variation on serfdom. Back to you, Nancy. Forgive my interrupting.
Yes, absolutely, and with no popular participation or very limited popular participation, and that's why the voter suppression, the extreme gerrymandering to let these Republican elected officials choose their voters rather than vice versa, why all of these radical rules changes are essential to make this work. And we should add here that not only has this cause ensured that Mitch McConnell in the Senate gave them a Supreme Court seat that should have gone to the previous president, but they are also organizing for a constitutional convention, the first state-convened constitutional convention.
Right, and there are 2 states short of that
lined
right
up
now.
28 of 34 states needed to do that. So this cause is so serious about radically changing the rules. They see democracy and capitalism, or at least democracy as we've known it over the 20th century, as antithetical, right? That democracy is a problem for capitalism, democracy as we've known it. So they want to radically change the rules in order to achieve the kind of dominance that they see as their due. So Americans really need to understand this. I know people are overwhelmed. Many people are working 2 jobs. They've got sandwich crisis between kids and grandparents. There's so many things going on in people's lives. But what happens over the next, 1 to 3 years is going to be decisive for the future, for as long as we can foresee, because these guys are so determined to bring about permanent radical rules change. So we have to be paying attention.
Let me ask you to put your prophet hat on, your analyst, looking forward into the future, which you talk about a little bit toward the end of the book. And we're talking with Nancy MacLean, the author of a book that you have to read. It's called Democracy in Chains. It's just an absolute expose of how we got where we are and where they're trying to take us. What happens if the court rolls back, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid? They've already rolled back, union protections, does away with environmental protections, but particularly those things that would hit the middle class really hard, really fast. And the wealthy states, California, New York, the populous states, pick these things up and say, okay, we're going to, because the court, this is the whole thing of the court, the 10th Amendment, just let the states do it, right? Let them figure out how they want to administer it. So we end up with a dozen or so states that are populous enough and wealthy enough that they can actually fund good schools, and they end public schools, right, and things like that, which they want to do. I mean, it's part of their agenda to end public schools. So let's say that they do this and it goes to the states, and we end up with a dozen or more states that become sort of like European countries, good places to live, and then we've got another 20 or 30 states that are these so-called red states, where people are living in poverty, they're oppressed by their employers, they have no health care. Right now in Mississippi, we've got infant mortality rates that are similar to those of most third world countries. At what point does this turn into civil war, or at what point does this turn into a country being torn apart?
Yeah, it's good that you raised that, because that's something that's been on my mind too. The people who are the architects of this cause think in a very cold, logical way, and think that they can manipulate the environment and people endlessly to achieve their goals. But I think that you're absolutely right, that they are tearing our country apart. They are deliberately turning us against one another. They are using racism strategically, as in promoting the myth of widespread voter fraud, in which it's suggested that it's people of color who shouldn't be voting, et cetera. So this is really, really scary, high-stakes stuff. And this is also a cause we need to understand, and I found in my research, that came together in the late 1950s in the Jim Crow South, a cause that thinks nothing of using such racism strategically in order to move their project of economic liberty, and that also advocates actions on the spectrum of secession, as someone I wrote about puts it, in order to achieve the will of capital. So they would like nothing better than to have mass secession, right? Because that decreases the collective power of the people through things like labor unions and the AARP and government and stuff, and increases the power of capital. So this is highly calculated. It is this deeply strategic. And another thing for you to know, though, too, is you're talking about those states like California, New York. These guys are so strategic that one of the things they built into the Trump tax bill was a measure to make it so that wealthy people in states like New York and California could no longer deduct their state and local income taxes. So that is deliberate social engineering in order to turn the wealthy people of those states against things like good public schools, health care protections, and so forth. And one of the strategists for this project, Stephen Moore, who's worked with the Heritage Foundation and many, many other groups, the Wall Street Journal, has said that if the wealthy people, taxpayers in those states don't like it, they should just move. So I think what we have to realize is that the right that we are dealing with now in America is playing an incredibly strategic, integrated, multi-part long game, whereas the left has been siloed, reactive, not seeing the whole picture, not articulating a big, overarching message, and it is really time to get serious, to understand what the other side is about, and to think about how we are going to protect, and I'm not exaggerating here, the popular achievements of the 20th century. Yeah. From the progressive era through the New Deal, through the civil rights era, the environmental era, and more. All of those things are now at risk.
Well, all of those things are actually not just at risk. Scott Pruitt is
being undermined as we speak. Yeah,
Scott Pruitt's tearing apart the EPA. Ryan Zinke is selling off public lands. Mick Mulvaney is destroying banking regulations and consumer protections. Donald Trump is openly promoting racism. I mean, it's just the whole thing. It's like a whole cloth.
I think in some ways too. I think people on the progressive side, and this includes our elected officials, sometimes get overwhelmed by the sheer number of radical rules changes happening, and we can get into the weeds with those particular changes. And I think what the American people need to understand is the big picture of all of this, of where it's going. And the big picture of all of this is that Charles Koch himself has been very clear that the kind of world he wants to bring in is not desired by the majority of the people. He actually said at the time he really started working on this in earnest in 1997, 98, he said, since we are greatly outnumbered, the failure to use our superior technology ensures failure. So he's basically admitting that nobody wants this libertarian world, right? People are not going to vote for it. They're not going to ask for it. They're going to run from it if they understand it. And that is why this cause is using a strategy.
Nancy, we're hitting a break here, but you're absolutely right. And the book is Democracy in Chains. Hang on just a second, Nancy.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Guy always steps on me. Nancy MacLean, Democracy in Chains. Nancy, thank you so much.